The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Copper Creek when 17-year-old Sarah Mitchell stumbled into town. Her dress was torn at the hem, her boots worn thin from walking, and her dark hair hung in tangled strands around her pale face. She clutched a small bundle of belongings against her chest, everything she owned in the world wrapped in a faded quilt her mother had stitched years ago. Sarah's stomach gnawed with hunger as she passed the general store. Through the window she could see jars of candy, fresh bread, and strips of jerky hanging from hooks. Her mouth watered, but her pockets held nothing but dust and regret. She had been walking for 3 days since leaving the orphanage in Millfield, where the matron had finally grown tired of feeding another mouth. The townspeople of Copper Creek watched her with suspicious eyes. Strangers were always viewed with caution in these parts, especially young women traveling alone. Sarah tried to ignore their stares as she made her way down the street, looking for any sign of work or kindness. Her feet ached and her vision blurred slightly from exhaustion and hunger. Outside Murphy's saloon, she noticed a group of men loading supplies into a wagon. One of them, a stocky man with a gray beard, was counting coins from a leather pouch. Sarah's desperate mind began to wander. Just a few coins would buy her a meal and maybe a place to sleep. She had never stolen anything in her life, but desperation makes people do things they never thought possible. She waited until the men went inside the saloon, then crept closer to the wagon. The leather pouch sat on the wagon seat, seemingly forgotten. Sarah's heart pounded as she reached for it, her fingers trembling. Just as she touched the leather, a rough hand grabbed her wrist. Well, what do we have here? The gray-bearded man had returned, and his grip was like iron around her thin wrist. Trying to help yourself to my money, girl. Sarah's face burned with shame. I wasn't... I'm sorry, sir. I was just... But the words died in her throat. There was no excuse for what she had almost done. Murphy! The man shouted toward the saloon. Call the sheriff! We got ourselves a little thief. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered. The sheriff, a tall man with a badge that caught the sunlight, pushed through the group. Sarah felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, all filled with judgment and disgust. She wanted to disappear into the dusty ground beneath her feet. What's the trouble here, Bill? The sheriff asked the gray-bearded man. Caught this girl red-handed trying to steal from my wagon, Bill replied, still holding Sarah's wrist. These drifters are all the same. Can't trust a one of them. The sheriff studied Sarah's face. She was clearly hungry and desperate, but the law was the law. I'm sorry, miss, but I'll have to lock you up until we can sort this out. Judge won't be through town for another week. As the sheriff reached for his handcuffs, a deep voice cut through the crowd. Hold on there, sheriff. Everyone turned to see a tall man walking toward them. He wore a weathered brown hat, a faded blue shirt, and boots that had seen countless miles. His face was tanned from years under the sun, with lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship. This was Jack Sullivan, known throughout the territory as one of the finest ranchers and straightest shooters around. What's your interest in this, Jack? The sheriff asked, pausing with the handcuffs in his hand. Jack stepped closer, his calm presence somehow making the crowd take a step back. Just curious about what actually happened here. He looked directly at Sarah, his gray eyes neither harsh nor soft, just studying. Did you take anything, girl? Sarah shook her head, tears threatening to spill over. No, sir, I almost did, but I didn't take anything. Bill, did she actually take any of your money? Jack asked. Bill's face reddened slightly. Well, no, but she was about to. I caught her reaching for it. Jack nodded thoughtfully. So she's being arrested for something she thought about doing but didn't actually do? The crowd began to murmur among themselves. The sheriff looked uncertain for the first time since arriving. The intent was there, Jack, the sheriff said. Can't have people thinking they can just help themselves to other folks' property. No, we can't, Jack agreed. But we also can't arrest people for crimes they didn't commit. He turned to Sarah again. What's your name and what brings you to Copper Creek? Sarah Mitchell, sir, she replied quietly. I was looking for work. I've been walking for 3 days and I haven't eaten since yesterday morning. I know that's no excuse for what I almost did, but I was desperate. Jack studied her face for a long moment. Something in her eyes told him she was telling the truth. There was shame there, but also a fierce determination that reminded him of someone from his past. Bill, how much money was in that pouch? Jack asked. About $20, Bill replied. Jack reached into his own pocket and pulled out a $20 gold piece. He handed it to Bill. There. Now you haven't lost anything, and this girl hasn't actually stolen anything. Seems like we can call this matter settled. Bill stared at the gold piece, then at Jack. You can't just pay for crimes that haven't been committed yet. Jack, I'm not paying for a crime, Jack replied calmly. I'm paying for a hungry girl's mistaken judgment before it became something worse. He looked around at the crowd. How many of you have never been desperate enough to consider doing something you knew was wrong? The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Most of them had known hunger, had known desperation in one form or another. The sheriff holstered his handcuffs. All right, Jack, I'll let this slide, but the girl needs to move along. Can't have her hanging around town causing more trouble. She won't be hanging around town, Jack said. She'll be coming to work at my ranch. The word surprised everyone, including Sarah. She stared at the tall cowboy with wide eyes, unsure if she had heard correctly. Jack, you don't know anything about this girl, the sheriff protested. I know she's hungry, desperate, and honest enough to admit when she's wrong. Jack replied. That's more than I can say for a lot of folks. He turned to Sarah. Can you cook? Sarah nodded eagerly. Yes, sir. I can cook, clean, mend clothes, tend a garden. Then you've got yourself a job, Sarah Mitchell. Room, board, and fair wages in exchange for honest work. As the crowd dispersed and the crisis passed, Sarah felt as though she could breathe again for the first time in days. This stranger had not only saved her from jail, but had offered her exactly what she had been searching for, a chance to start over. The Sullivan Ranch stretched as far as Sarah could see in every direction. Rolling hills covered in grass swayed in the afternoon breeze, and cattle dotted the landscape like brown and white stones. The ranch house itself was modest but well built, with a wide front porch and windows that caught the golden light. Behind it stood a barn, a chicken coop, and several other outbuildings that spoke of a working ranch. Jack helped Sarah down from his wagon and gestured toward the house. Mrs. Chen does most of the cooking, but she's been needing help with the cleaning and mending. You'll have your own room in the back of the house. As they approached the front door, it swung open to reveal a small Chinese woman with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her eyes were sharp and intelligent, and she studied Sarah with the same careful attention Jack had shown in town. Mrs. Chen, this is Sarah Mitchell, Jack said. She'll be helping around the house. Sarah, Mrs. Chen has been keeping this place running for 15 years. You'll answer to her. Mrs. Chen nodded at Sarah. You look hungry, girl. Come eat first, then we see what you can do. The kitchen was warm and filled with wonderful smells. Mrs. Chen ladled thick stew into a bowl and set it before Sarah, along with fresh bread and butter. Sarah tried to eat slowly, maintaining her manners, but her hunger was too great. She finished every drop and every crumb. When did you eat last? Mrs. Chen asked, watching Sarah's face. 2 days ago, ma'am. Some berries I found along the road. Mrs. Chen shook her head and refilled the bowl without being asked. Eat more. Too skinny. As Sarah ate her second helping, she became aware of voices outside. Through the window, she could see Jack talking with 2 other men near the barn. One was a young man about her own age with sandy hair and a friendly smile. The other was older, perhaps in his 40s, with a serious expression and arms crossed over his chest. That's Tommy and Frank, Mrs. Chen explained, noticing Sarah's gaze. Tommy is good boy, works hard, Frank. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Frank thinks girls should not work on ranch. He will give you trouble. After Sarah finished eating, Mrs. Chen showed her to a small but clean room at the back of the house. It had a bed, a dresser, a wash basin, and a window that looked out over the vegetable garden. It was the nicest room Sarah had ever had to herself. You rest now, Mrs. Chen said. Tomorrow we start early. That evening, Sarah sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The peace of the ranch was something she had never experienced before. At the orphanage, there had always been noise, arguments, crying children. Here, the only sounds were the gentle lowing of cattle, the chirping of crickets, and the soft whisper of wind through the grass. Jack emerged from the barn and walked over to the porch. He sat on the steps, his hat in his hands. Settling in all right? Yes, sir, Mrs. Chen has been very kind. And this room? It's wonderful. Thank you, Jack nodded. Tomorrow you'll meet the rest of the crew. There's Tommy, who you saw earlier. Good kid, handles the horses mostly. Then there's Frank, my foreman. He's been with me for 8 years, knows cattle better than anyone. But he's got some old-fashioned ideas about women working on ranches. Sarah's stomach tightened with worry. Will he make me leave? No, Jack said firmly. I make the decisions about who works here. But I won't lie to you. He'll make things difficult at first. You'll have to prove yourself. The next morning, Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of Mrs. Chen moving around the kitchen. She dressed quickly and joined the older woman who was already preparing breakfast for the ranch hands. Good, you wake early, Mrs. Chen said approvingly. Ranch starts before sun comes up. Sarah helped prepare eggs, bacon, biscuits, and coffee for the men. When Tommy came in for breakfast, he tipped his hat politely and smiled at Sarah. Morning, miss. I'm Tommy Rodriguez. Welcome to the ranch. Thank you, Tommy. I'm Sarah. Frank entered a few minutes later, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He looked at Sarah with obvious disapproval, then sat down without acknowledging her presence. Frank, meet Sarah Mitchell, Jack said as he joined them at the table. She'll be helping Mrs. Chen with the household work. Frank grunted something that might have been a greeting and focused on his food. After breakfast, Mrs. Chen showed Sarah her duties. There was laundry to wash and hang, floors to sweep and mop, vegetables to tend in the garden and clothes to mend. Sarah threw herself into the work with enthusiasm, grateful to finally have a purpose and a place. Around midday, she was hanging laundry on the line when she heard gunshots coming from behind the barn. Her heart raced, thinking there might be trouble, but Mrs. Chen appeared beside her and shook her head. Target practice, Mrs. Chen explained. Jack teaches shooting. Very good shot. Best in 3 counties. Sarah walked around to the back of the barn where she could see Jack standing about 20 feet from several tin cans lined up on fence posts. His revolver was in his hand, and as she watched, he fired 6 shots in rapid succession. All 6 cans went flying. Impressive, she murmured to herself. It's all in the stance and the breathing, Jack said, having heard her approach. Most folks think shooting is about having a steady hand, but it's really about having a calm mind. Tommy was there too, practicing with his own gun. His aim was good, but not as precise as Jack's. Could you teach me? Sarah asked suddenly, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. Both men turned to stare at her. Tommy looked intrigued, but Jack frowned. Why would you want to learn to shoot? Sarah thought about her journey to Copper Creek, about walking alone for 3 days, about the fear she had felt when strange men had approached her on the road. A woman traveling alone needs to be able to protect herself. Jack studied her face for a long moment. Learning to shoot is serious business, Sarah. A gun isn't a toy. I understand that, sir. I've seen what guns can do. Frank appeared from around the corner of the barn, having finished his midday chores. When he saw Sarah standing with Jack and Tommy near the shooting area, his expression darkened. What's she doing here? Frank demanded. Sarah asked if I'd teach her to shoot. Jack replied calmly. Frank's face reddened. Teach her to shoot? Jack, she's a girl. Girls don't need to know how to handle guns. That's men's work. Every person on this ranch should know how to defend themselves and the property, Jack said. That includes Sarah. This is foolishness, Frank muttered. Next thing you know, she'll be wanting to ride with us on cattle drives. Sarah felt her face burn with embarrassment, but also with a growing anger. I'm standing right here, Mr. Frank. If you have something to say about me, you can say it to me. Frank's eyebrows shot up in surprise at her directness. Well, I never... The girl's got a mouth on her, too. She's got a point, though, Tommy said quietly. My sister can outshoot half the men in town. Jack reloaded his revolver and handed it to Sarah. Let's see what you can do with this. The gun was heavier than Sarah had expected, and her hand trembled slightly as she raised it toward the targets. She tried to remember what Jack had said about stance and breathing. She planted her feet firmly, took a deep breath, and squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, missing all the targets completely. Frank snorted with derision. There you go. Waste of time and ammunition. But Jack was watching Sarah's face, seeing the determination there. Try again. This time, don't hold your breath. Breathe normally and fire at the end of your exhale. Sarah nodded and raised the gun again. This time her shot hit the fence post just below one of the cans. Better, Jack said. You've got potential. We'll practice every day after your morning chores are done. Frank shook his head in disgust and stalked away, muttering under his breath about the world going crazy. That evening, as Sarah helped Mrs. Chen prepare dinner, she found herself thinking about the weight of the gun in her hand, the power she had felt when she pulled the trigger. For the first time in her life, she felt like she might be able to take control of her own destiny. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah arrived at the Sullivan Ranch. and her days had settled into a comfortable rhythm. She rose before dawn to help Mrs. Chen prepare breakfast, spent her mornings doing household chores, practiced shooting with Jack in the afternoon, and helped with dinner preparations in the evening. Her aim had improved considerably, though she was still far from the level of skill she admired in Jack. The morning air was crisp as Sarah hung the last of the laundry on the line. October was settling over the ranch, painting the cottonwood trees along the creek in shades of gold and orange. She had grown to love the quiet beauty of the place, so different from the cramped, noisy orphanage where she had spent most of her childhood. As she picked up the empty laundry basket, she heard the sound of approaching horses. Jack, Tommy, and Frank were returning from checking the cattle in the north pasture, their horses kicking up small clouds of dust as they rode toward the barn. But something was wrong. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the tension in their postures. Jack's usually relaxed seat in the saddle was rigid, and Frank was gesturing angrily as he spoke. Sarah hurried to the barn, arriving just as the men were dismounting. 20 head missing from the north pasture, Frank was saying, his voice tight with anger, and I found tracks leading toward the Morrison place. That doesn't mean Morrison took them, Jack replied, but his jaw was set in a hard line. Who else would it be? Frank demanded. He's been eyeing our cattle for months, ever since his own herd got sick. Sarah had heard talk of Ben Morrison around the dinner table. He owned the neighboring ranch, which had fallen on hard times after disease had swept through his cattle the previous spring. The loss had left him struggling to make ends meet, and bitter toward his more successful neighbors. We need proof before we go making accusations, Jack said firmly. Tommy, saddle a fresh horse. We're going to follow those tracks and see where they lead. I'm coming with you, Frank declared. No, I need you to stay here and keep watch on the rest of the herd. If someone is rustling our cattle, they might come back for more. Frank's face darkened, but he nodded grudgingly. Sarah could see he didn't like being left behind while Jack rode into potential danger. As Jack prepared to leave with Tommy, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. Mr. Sullivan, could I come with you? All three men turned to stare at her. Frank's expression was one of pure disbelief. Absolutely not, Jack said immediately. This could be dangerous, Sarah. Cattle rustlers don't take kindly to being tracked. But you said everyone on this ranch should be able to defend themselves, Sarah argued. I've been practicing with my shooting. I could be useful. Useful? Frank laughed harshly. Girl, this isn't target practice with tin cans. These are real men with real guns who won't hesitate to shoot. Sarah felt her cheeks burn, but she stood her ground. I know it's dangerous, but I also know this ranch has given me a home when I had nowhere else to go. If someone is stealing from you, they're stealing from me too. Jack studied her face for a long moment. Something in her expression reminded him of his younger sister, who had died in a fever epidemic years ago. She had possessed the same fierce loyalty and stubborn courage. She's got sand, I'll give her that, Tommy said quietly. And she's not a bad shot anymore. This is madness, Frank muttered. Next thing you know, she'll want to join the cattle drives. Jack made his decision. Sarah, go get your gun and meet us by the horses. But you follow orders without question, understand? This isn't a game. Sarah nodded eagerly and ran to get the revolver Jack had given her to practice with. Her hands trembled slightly as she strapped on the gun belt, but it was excitement rather than fear that made them shake. Frank shook his head in disgust as Sarah returned. Mark my words, Jack, no good will come of this. The three riders followed the cattle tracks north across rolling hills covered in autumn grass. Jack rode in front, his experienced eyes reading the signs on the ground like a book. Tommy rode beside Sarah, occasionally pointing out details she would have missed. Broken twigs on bushes where cattle had passed, hoofprints in soft earth near the creek, dried manure that indicated how long ago the herd had moved through. After 2 hours of following the trail, they crested a ridge and saw the Morrison Ranch spread out in the valley below. The place looked run down compared to the Sullivan Ranch. The barn needed paint, several fence posts were broken, and weeds grew tall around the house. There, Jack said quietly, pointing toward a pasture behind Morrison's barn. 20 head of cattle, all wearing our brand. Sarah could see the animals clearly, and her heart sank. The evidence was undeniable. So what do we do now? Tommy asked. We go down there and talk to Morrison, Jack replied. Maybe there's an explanation we haven't thought of. As they rode down into the valley, Ben Morrison emerged from his barn. He was a thin man in his 50s with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who had worked outdoors his entire life. When he saw the three riders approaching, his expression grew wary. "Afternoon, Ben," Jack called out as they drew near. "Jack." Morrison's greeting was cautious. His eyes flicked to Sarah and Tommy, then back to Jack. "What brings you over this way?" "Lost some cattle last night," Jack said, keeping his voice casual. "Been following their trail. Seems to lead right to your back pasture." Morrison's face flushed red. "Are you accusing me of stealing your cattle?" "I'm not accusing you of anything, Ben. I'm asking for an explanation." For a moment, the two men stared at each other in tense silence. Sarah could feel the danger in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Her hand moved instinctively toward her gun, but she forced herself to keep it relaxed. Finally, Morrison's shoulders sagged in defeat. "They wandered onto my land during the night," he said quietly. "I found them this morning, mixed in with what's left of my own herd." "Ben," Jack's voice held a note of sympathy. "I know what you're thinking." Morrison continued, his voice growing bitter. "Poor old Morrison. Lost his cattle to disease. Must be desperate enough to steal from his neighbors." "That's not what I'm thinking," Jack said gently. Morrison looked up at Jack with eyes full of pain and pride. "My youngest daughter needs medicine, Jack. The doctor in town wants $15 and I don't have 15 cents. When I saw those cattle," he swallowed hard, "I thought maybe I could sell one or two, just enough to buy the medicine." Sarah felt her heart break for the man. She remembered her own desperation in Copper Creek, the moment when hunger had almost driven her to theft. "Why didn't you come to me?" Jack asked. "I would have helped." "I've got my pride," Morrison replied stiffly. Jack dismounted and walked over to Morrison. After a moment's hesitation, he extended his hand. "Bring your daughter to Mrs. Chen tomorrow. She knows more about healing than any doctor in 3 counties, and we'll work something out about the cattle." Morrison stared at Jack's outstretched hand, then slowly reached out and shook it. "I don't deserve your kindness, Jack. We all make mistakes when we're desperate. Ben, the measure of a man isn't whether he falls down, it's whether he gets back up." As they prepared to leave with the recovered cattle, Sarah reflected on what she had witnessed. Jack could have had Morrison arrested for cattle rustling. Instead, he had shown mercy and understanding. It was a lesson she would never forget. The ride home was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. As the Sullivan Ranch came into view, Sarah realized that she had seen something important today. Not just the recovery of stolen cattle, but the true character of the man who had given her a second chance. That evening, as she helped Mrs. Chen prepare dinner, Sarah found herself thinking about Morrison's desperate choice and Jack's merciful response. She was beginning to understand that real strength wasn't just about being able to shoot straight or ride hard. Sometimes the strongest thing a person could do was show compassion to someone who didn't deserve it. Winter was settling over the ranch with a vengeance. Snow had been falling steadily for 2 days, and the wind howled across the prairie like a living thing. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching the white drifts pile higher against the barn and fence posts. In the distance, she could barely make out the shapes of cattle huddled together for warmth. "Bad storm," Mrs. Chen said, joining Sarah at the window. "Worst I've seen in 5 years." Sarah had been at the ranch for 3 months now, and her shooting had improved dramatically. Jack said she was one of the best natural shots he had ever taught, with an instinct for accuracy that couldn't be taught. But she had never been tested in a real crisis, and the thought made her nervous. The kitchen door burst open, bringing a swirl of snow and bitter cold air. Jack stumbled in, his coat white with snow and his face red from the wind. "Storm's getting worse," he announced, stomping the snow off his boots. "We've got cattle scattered all over the North Range, and if we don't get them gathered up soon, we'll lose half the herd to the cold." Tommy came in behind Jack, followed by Frank. All 3 men looked exhausted from fighting the storm. "Can't see more than 10 feet in any direction," Tommy reported. "The snow's coming down so thick it's like trying to see through a white curtain." Frank shook his head grimly. "We need at least 6 riders to cover that much ground, and we've only got 3. By the time we round up all the cattle, some of them will already be frozen." Sarah listened to their conversation with growing determination. She knew what she had to do, even if the men wouldn't like it. "You've got 4 riders," she said quietly. All 3 men turned to stare at her. Frank's expression immediately darkened. "Absolutely not," Jack said firmly. "Sarah, this isn't like tracking Morrison's cattle. This is a blizzard. People die in storms like this. People also die when they lose their livelihood, Sarah replied. This ranch is my home too, and I won't stand by and watch while it's destroyed. The girl's got a point, Tommy said reluctantly. We do need more riders, and she's gotten pretty good with a gun. Frank snorted in derision. Pretty good at shooting tin cans, maybe. But can she handle herself when her horse goes down in a snowdrift? Can she find her way home when she can't see her own hand in front of her face? There's only one way to find out, Sarah said, meeting Frank's challenging stare. Jack rubbed his forehead, clearly torn between his need for help and his desire to keep Sarah safe. Even if I agreed to let you come, which I haven't, you don't have proper winter gear. You'd freeze to death before we got a mile from the house. Mrs. Chen disappeared into her room and returned a few minutes later, carrying a heavy coat, woolen gloves, and a warm hat. These belong to Jack's sister, she said simply. Same size as Sarah. Jack stared at the clothes in Mrs. Chen's hands. His sister Emma had died of fever 10 years ago, and seeing her things again brought back painful memories. But he also remembered Emma's fierce independence and her refusal to be left behind when there was important work to be done. Mrs. Chen, he said softly, I can't ask Sarah to risk her life. You're not asking, Sarah interrupted. I'm volunteering. And if you won't take me with you, I'll follow on my own. At least if I'm with the group, you can keep an eye on me. Jack looked at each of his companions in turn. Tommy nodded encouragingly. Frank shook his head in disgust but didn't object further. Mrs. Chen simply smiled and held out Emma's coat. Fine, Jack said finally, but you stay close to me at all times. If I tell you to do something, you do it immediately without argument, and if the storm gets any worse, we turn back, even if it means losing cattle. An hour later, 4 riders emerged from the barn into the howling wind. Sarah had never experienced cold like this. The wind cut through her heavy coat like a knife, and snow stung her face despite the hat pulled low over her eyes. Her horse, a steady mare named Belle, stepped carefully through the deepening drifts. The world had become a white void. Sarah could barely see Tommy riding beside her, and Jack's dark coat was just a shadow ahead. The only sounds were the whistle of the wind and the muffled thud of their horses' hooves in the snow. They had been riding for less than an hour when they heard it. The frightened bawling of cattle somewhere off to their left. Jack raised his hand, signaling for the group to stop and listen. Sounds like they're stuck in the draw near Wilson Creek, Jack called out, his voice barely audible over the wind. They turned their horses toward the sound and rode carefully down a steep slope. At the bottom, they found nearly 15 head of cattle trapped in a narrow ravine. The animals were cold, frightened, and unable to climb out through the deep snow. Tommy, you and Frank work on getting them moving up the slope, Jack instructed. Sarah and I will push them from behind. The work was exhausting. The cattle were stubborn and panicked, refusing to move despite the cowboys' efforts to drive them forward. Sarah's hands were numb with cold and her face felt like ice, but she kept working alongside the men. After what felt like hours, they finally got the cattle moving up out of the ravine. But as they reached the top, disaster struck. Frank's horse stepped in a hidden hole and went down hard, throwing Frank into a snowbank. The horse struggled to get up, clearly favoring one of its front legs. Frank! Tommy shouted, dismounting to help his injured companion. Frank sat up slowly, wincing in pain. Think I broke my wrist, he said through gritted teeth. And the horse is lame. Jack looked at the injured man and horse, then at the cattle they still needed to gather. The storm was getting worse and they were running out of time. Tommy, you take Frank back to the ranch, Jack decided.
Sarah and I will gather the rest of the cattle. Jack?
You can't handle all those cattle with just 2 people, Frank protested. We'll manage, Jack replied grimly. Tommy helped Frank onto his horse, and they disappeared into the white curtain of snow. Sarah found herself alone with Jack in the middle of a blizzard, responsible for saving the rest of the herd. You sure you're up for this? Jack asked, studying her face through the swirling snow. Sarah's teeth were chattering and she could no longer feel her feet in her boots. But her resolve was stronger than ever. Let's get those cattle home. For the next 3 hours, Sarah and Jack worked as a team. They found cattle scattered across miles of range, some nearly buried in snowdrifts, others wandering aimlessly through the storm. Each group they found, they drove toward the ranch, slowly building a larger herd. Sarah's shooting skills proved invaluable when they encountered a pack of wolves stalking the weakened cattle. Her first shot scared off 2 of the predators, and her second brought down the pack leader. The remaining wolves fled into the storm. Good shooting, Jack said. his respect for her abilities clearly growing. As they approached the ranch with the last group of cattle, Sarah realized she had proven something to herself as much as to Jack. She wasn't just a girl who could shoot tin cans. She was a rancher who could handle herself in a crisis. The warm light of the ranch house windows had never looked so welcoming. As they drove the cattle into the shelter of the barn, Mrs. Chen appeared with hot coffee and blankets. "All cattle safe?" she asked. "All safe," Jack confirmed. "Thanks to Sarah here. I couldn't have done it without her." Even Frank, his arm now in a sling, nodded grudgingly. "Girl's got more grit than I gave her credit for," he admitted. "Still think the world's gone crazy, but at least it's gone crazy in our favor." That night, as Sarah sat by the fire warming her hands around a cup of hot coffee, she reflected on what she had accomplished. She had faced real danger and proven herself capable of handling it. More importantly, she had earned the respect of the men she worked alongside. Jack sat down beside her, his own coffee steaming in the firelight. "You did good work out there today, Sarah. Real cowboy work." Sarah smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. For the first time in her life, she felt like she truly belonged somewhere. Spring had arrived at the Sullivan Ranch with a burst of wildflowers and green grass that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. Sarah had been living and working at the ranch for almost 8 months now, and she had changed in ways she never could have imagined when she first stumbled into Copper Creek as a desperate, hungry girl. Her shooting had become legendary in the area. Travelers who stopped at the ranch often asked to see the girl who could outshoot most men, and Sarah had grown comfortable with her reputation. But more than her skill with a gun, she had developed the confidence and bearing of someone who belonged on the range. The morning sun was just breaking over the hills when Sarah heard the sound of multiple horses approaching at a fast gallop. She set down the bucket of chicken feed she had been carrying and shaded her eyes to see better. 3 riders were coming, hard toward the ranch house, and even from a distance, she could tell something was wrong. Jack emerged from the barn and walked to meet the riders as they pulled up in front of the house. Sarah recognized Sheriff Watson from Copper Creek, along with 2 men she didn't know, one wearing a deputy's badge and the other dressed in a dark suit that marked him as someone from outside the territory. "Morning, Jack," Sheriff Watson called out, dismounting from his lathered horse. "Sorry to ride out here so early, but we've got ourselves a situation." "What kind of situation?" Jack asked, his voice cautious. The man in the dark suit stepped forward. "I'm Marshal Henderson from the territorial capital. We're tracking a gang of bank robbers who hit the First National in Millbrook yesterday. Killed 2 people, including a woman." Sarah felt her blood run cold. Millbrook was the town where she had lived at the orphanage. She knew the bank, had walked past it hundreds of times during her years there. 4 men, the marshal continued. They got away with nearly $3,000. We tracked them this far before losing their trail in the rocky country north of here. Haven't seen any strangers around here, Jack replied, but we'll keep our eyes open. Sheriff Watson shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Jack, there's something else. The gang's leader. Witnesses described him as a tall man with dark hair and gray eyes. Said he was well-spoken like an educated man. Reminded me of someone." Sarah saw Jack's jaw tighten. She knew that description could fit dozens of men, but she also knew there was history here she didn't understand. "You thinking what I think you're thinking, Sheriff?" Jack asked quietly. "Your brother Daniel was seen in Millbrook 2 weeks ago, Jack, and you know his history with banks." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. Sarah had never heard him mention a brother named Daniel, but she could see the pain in his eyes at the sheriff's words. "Daniel's been gone for 5 years, Jack said firmly. "Last I heard, he was working cattle drives in Colorado." "Well, he's back in the territory now," Marshal Henderson said, "and whether he's involved in this robbery or not, we need to find him for questioning." After the lawmen left, Jack stood in the yard for a long time, staring at the northern hills where the gang's trail had disappeared. Sarah approached him cautiously, sensing his pain but not sure how to help. "You want to talk about it?" she asked gently. Jack was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wasn't going to answer. Finally, he spoke without looking at her. "Daniel is 3 years younger than me. Smart as a whip, could charm birds out of trees. But he always wanted easy money instead of honest work." Jack's voice was heavy with old hurt. "He robbed his first bank when he was 19. I tried to talk sense into him, but he said working a ranch was for fools. Said there was too much money sitting in banks just waiting to be taken. What happened? He got caught after the third robbery. Spent 2 years in territorial prison. When he got out, he came here asking for help. I gave him a job, tried to set him straight. Jack's hands clenched into fists. He repaid me by stealing money from my safe and running off in the middle of the night. That was 5 years ago. Sarah felt a surge of anger toward this brother she had never met. Jack had shown her nothing but kindness and opportunity, and she couldn't imagine betraying that trust. Maybe it's not him, she offered. Maybe the witnesses were wrong. Jack finally looked at her, and she saw both hope and resignation in his eyes. Maybe. But if it is Daniel, he'll come here eventually. This ranch is the only safe place he knows. That afternoon, while Jack rode out to check the cattle, Sarah was in the vegetable garden pulling weeds when she heard a horse approaching from the north. She looked up to see a lone rider coming toward the ranch at an easy pace, as if he had all the time in the world. The man was tall and dark-haired, just as the marshal had described. He sat his horse with the same easy grace Jack displayed, and, even from a distance, Sarah could see the family resemblance. This had to be Daniel Sullivan. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to the gun at her hip. She had been wearing it regularly since the blizzard, and it had become as natural to her as breathing. Something about this approaching rider made her skin crawl with unease. Daniel rode into the yard and dismounted with a casual smile. Up close, Sarah could see that he was indeed handsome and charming, just as Jack had described. But there was something cold in his gray eyes that reminded her of a snake. "Well, well," Daniel said, his voice smooth and cultured. "Jack's got himself a pretty little helper. I'm Daniel Sullivan, Jack's brother, and you would be?" "Sarah Mitchell," she replied carefully, not moving from her position near the garden gate. "Sarah Mitchell," Daniel repeated, as if tasting the name. "You know, Sarah, I think you and I are going to be great friends." Something in his tone made Sarah's flesh crawl. "Mr. Sullivan isn't here right now. He's out checking the cattle." "Oh, I know exactly where my brother is," Daniel said with that cold smile. "I've been watching the ranch for 2 days. Learned quite a bit about the people who live here. That Chinese woman who does the cooking, the young Mexican fellow who handles the horses, the older man who doesn't like women working on ranches." His eyes fixed on Sarah. "And you, the girl who can shoot better than most men." Sarah's heart began to race. If Daniel had been watching the ranch for 2 days, he knew everyone's routines, their weaknesses, their blind spots. "What do you want?" she asked directly. "Straight to the point. I like that." Daniel walked closer, and Sarah noticed the way his hand rested casually near his gun. "I want what's mine, Sarah. This ranch should have been half mine when our father died. But Jack got it all because he was the responsible son." "Jack said you robbed banks." Daniel laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Jack says a lot of things. Did he tell you about the money I made for this ranch? The cattle I helped buy with my ill-gotten gains? No, I bet he didn't mention that part." Sarah didn't believe a word of it, but she kept her expression neutral. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to help me get what's rightfully mine. See, Jack's got a safe in his study with about $2,000 in it. Money he owes me from years ago. I'm going to take it and you're going to help me." "I won't steal from Jack," Sarah said firmly. Daniel's smile disappeared, replaced by something much more dangerous. "Oh, but you will, Sarah. Because if you don't, I'll tell everyone in Copper Creek about your past, about how you were caught trying to steal from Bill Murphy's wagon, how you were marked as a thief before my soft-hearted brother took pity on you." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The shame of that day in Copper Creek still haunted her, and the thought of everyone knowing about it was almost unbearable. "I see that got your attention," Daniel continued. "Your reputation would be ruined, Sarah. No one would trust you. No one would hire you. You'd be right back where you started, hungry and desperate on the road to nowhere." For a moment, Sarah wavered. The fear of losing everything she had built, everything she had become, was overwhelming. But then she thought about Jack's kindness, about the home he had given her, about the trust he had placed in her. No, she said quietly. Excuse me? I said no. Sarah's voice grew stronger. I won't help you steal from Jack no matter what you threaten me with. Daniel's face darkened with anger. You stupid little girl, do you have any idea what I could do to you? Sarah's hand moved to rest on the grip of her gun. Do you have any idea what I could do to you? For the first time since his arrival, Daniel looked uncertain. He had underestimated this girl, thinking her past shame would make her easy to manipulate. The sound of approaching horses broke the tense standoff. Jack was returning with Tommy and Frank, their workday finished. Sarah felt a wave of relief, but she also knew the real confrontation was just beginning. Daniel straightened his coat and put his charming smile back in place. This isn't over, Sarah. Not by a long shot. Jack's face went through a series of emotions as he rode into the yard and saw his brother standing near the garden. First there was surprise, then a flash of joy at seeing family, followed quickly by wariness and finally resignation. He dismounted slowly, his eyes never leaving Daniel's face. Hello, Jack, Daniel said, his charming smile firmly in place. You're looking well, brother. Daniel. Jack's voice was carefully neutral. It's been a long time. Tommy and Frank hung back, sensing the tension in the air. Both men had heard stories about Jack's outlaw brother, and neither looked comfortable with his sudden appearance. 5 years, Daniel agreed. 5 long years of wandering from place to place, never finding anywhere that felt like home. This ranch was always home to me, Jack. You made your choice when you stole from me and ran, Jack replied quietly. And from what I hear, you've been making the same kind of choices ever since. Daniel's smile faltered slightly. Ah, so the law's been here already. I wondered why that girl of yours looked so nervous. He glanced at Sarah with cold amusement. Tell me, Jack, does she know about her past? About how she was caught trying to steal in Copper Creek before you rescued her? Sarah felt her cheeks burn with shame, but she kept her head high. She had learned that running from the truth only gave it more power over you. Yes, I know, Jack said simply. Sarah told me about it herself weeks ago. Takes courage to admit your mistakes. Courage, Daniel repeated mockingly. Is that what we're calling it now? He gestured around the ranch yard. Amazing how you always find these lost souls to take in, Jack. First that Chinese woman, now this girl. Do you think saving them somehow makes up for not saving me? The words hit their mark and Sarah could see Jack flinch, but his voice remained steady when he replied. I tried to save you, Daniel. You didn't want to be saved? What I wanted was to be treated like an equal partner instead of a charity case. Daniel shot back. This ranch belonged to both of us, Jack. Father left it to both of us. Father left it to both of us to work together, Jack corrected. You chose a different path. The conversation was interrupted by the appearance of Mrs. Chen on the front porch. She took one look at Daniel and immediately disappeared back into the house. Sarah knew the older woman was going for the shotgun she kept by the kitchen door. Daniel noticed the movement too and chuckled. Still keeping armed women around, I see. You always did have interesting taste in companions, Jack. State your business, Daniel, Jack said, his patience clearly wearing thin. What do you want? What I've always wanted. What's rightfully mine. Daniel's mask of charm finally slipped completely. $2,000, Jack. The money you owe me for my share of this place. You forfeited your share when you turned outlaw, Jack replied. Did I? Because I seem to remember helping to build this place. I remember working cattle drives to earn money for breeding stock. I remember fighting off rustlers and wolves right alongside you. Daniel's voice grew bitter. But when I made one mistake, one bad choice, you wrote me off completely. Sarah watched the exchange with growing unease. She could see that Daniel's words were affecting Jack, making him doubt himself. But she could also see the manipulation in Daniel's approach, the way he twisted the truth to serve his purposes. One mistake? Frank spoke up suddenly, his voice harsh with disbelief. Boy, you robbed 3 banks and spent 2 years in prison. That's not one mistake. That's a pattern. Daniel's eyes flashed dangerously as he turned to Frank. I don't believe I was talking to you, old man. Well, I'm talking to you, Frank replied, stepping forward. I've heard about your kind my whole life. Silver-tongued devils who think the world owes them something. Jack doesn't owe you a damn thing. The situation was escalating quickly, and Sarah could feel violence building in the air like pressure before a thunderstorm. Her hand rested on her gun, ready to draw if necessary. Gentlemen, Daniel said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I think we're getting off track here. I didn't come for a family reunion. I came for what's mine, and I'm not leaving without it. Then you'll be here a long time, Jack said firmly. Because you're not getting any money from me. Daniel's composure finally cracked completely. You self-righteous hypocrite. You sit here on your throne of moral superiority, taking in strays and pretending to be such a good man. But you couldn't even save your own brother. I couldn't save someone who didn't want to be saved. Jack shouted back, his own control breaking. I gave you every chance, Daniel. Every opportunity to make something of yourself. But you chose the easy path, the crooked path, every single time. The easy path? Daniel laughed harshly. You think robbing banks is easy? You think living as an outlaw is easy? I've been shot at, chased, hunted like an animal for 5 years. All because I refuse to spend my life scratching in the dirt like some peasant farmer. You've been hunted because you're a killer, Sarah said quietly, speaking for the first time since Jack's return. The marshal said you killed 2 people in Millbrook, including a woman. Daniel turned to her with eyes full of rage. You don't know what you're talking about, little girl. Sometimes people get hurt in the course of business. That doesn't make me a killer. It makes you exactly a killer, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her fear.
And it makes you someone who doesn't deserve Jack's help or anyone else's. Daniel's hand moved to his gun.
I've had about enough of your mouth, girl. The next few seconds seemed to stretch into hours. Daniel's gun cleared leather first, but Sarah's training with Jack had taught her that speed wasn't everything. It was accuracy that mattered. As Daniel brought his weapon up, Sarah drew and fired in one smooth motion. Her bullet caught Daniel in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying. He crashed to the ground, cursing and holding his wounded arm. Sarah, Jack shouted, but she was already moving. Her gun trained on Daniel as he writhed in the dust. Tommy and Frank rushed forward to secure Daniel's weapon, while Mrs. Chen emerged from the house with her shotgun, ready to provide backup if needed. You little witch, Daniel gasped, glaring up at Sarah from the ground. You shot me! I could have killed you, Sarah replied calmly. Jack taught me to shoot true, but he also taught me to show mercy when possible. Jack knelt beside his brother, examining the wound. It's not fatal, but you'll need a doctor. Don't pretend to care about me now, Daniel snarled. I've always cared about you, Daniel. That was never the problem. Jack's voice was infinitely sad. The problem was that you never cared about anything but yourself. Sheriff Watson and Marshal Henderson arrived an hour later, drawn by reports of gunfire from neighboring ranches. They took Daniel into custody, though he would need medical attention before he could travel far. As the lawmen prepared to leave with their prisoner, Daniel looked back at Jack one final time. This isn't over, brother. Blood is thicker than water, and someday you'll remember that. Blood may be thicker than water, Jack replied quietly, but loyalty and honor are thicker than blood. Sarah proved that today. After the dust had settled and the excitement was over, Jack found Sarah sitting on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. He sat down beside her, both of them quiet for a long time. You saved my life today, Jack said finally. Daniel would have killed me if you hadn't stopped him. He was your brother, Sarah replied. That must have been hard for you, Jack nodded slowly. It was. But family isn't just about blood, Sarah. It's about the people who stand by you when things get difficult. The people who choose to stay when they could easily leave. Sarah looked at him, seeing the pain in his eyes, but also something else. Pride, respect, and genuine affection. I learned to shoot from the best teacher in the territory, she said with a small smile. It would have been a shame to waste all that training. Jack chuckled despite his sadness. You shoot truer than any son I could have had, Sarah Mitchell. Truer and with more heart. As the stars came out over the ranch that had become her home, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had arrived as a girl marked as a thief, desperate and alone. She was leaving that old identity behind as a woman who had found her place in the world. Not as someone's charity case, but as someone who had earned her position through courage, skill, and loyalty. The ranch stretched out before her in the gathering darkness, and Sarah knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them. Jack had taught her to shoot straight and true, but more than that, he had taught her to aim for something worthy of her efforts. And in the end, that made all the difference.